The church was a scene of serene beauty. Golden sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant patterns on the polished wooden pews. Guests murmured softly, the air thick with anticipation as they waited for the bride to walk down the aisle. The organist began playing a melodic tune, signaling that the ceremony was about to commence. Clara stood just outside the grand double doors, her heart racing. She clutched her father's arm tightly, her wedding dress cascading around her like a cloud. This was the moment she had dreamed of for years, a celebration of love, resilience, and new beginnings. James was already waiting at the altar, his wheelchair positioned beside the pastor. His suit was immaculate, and his calm, steady smile brought warmth to the room. Clara couldn't help but admire him. James had been her rock, the man who reminded her that love could be powerful and transformative. Today wasn't just about their union. It was a symbol of triumph over the odds stacked against them. The congregation rose as the double doors opened. Clara took her first step down the aisle, her father steadying her trembling hand. She glanced around at the sea of smiling faces. Old friends, colleagues, and even distant relatives had come to witness this extraordinary moment. But just as she reached the halfway point, the sound of hurried footsteps shattered the harmony of the ceremony. A woman burst into the church, her voice ringing out above the organ's melody. "Stop this wedding. You don't know the truth about him." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara froze mid-step, her heart pounding. Her father instinctively pulled her closer, shielding her from the unexpected interruption. All eyes turned to the intruder, a middle-aged woman with disheveled hair and an air of desperation. She stood at the entrance, her eyes blazing as they locked onto James. James's face turned ashen. The warmth in his smile vanished, replaced by a look of dread. Clara's gaze darted between James and the woman, confusion and fear swirling inside her. The pastor cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, this is a private ceremony. I must ask you to leave." But the woman refused to budge. She stepped further into the aisle, her voice trembling yet firm. "I can't let you marry him, Clara. He's been lying to you. He's not the man you think he is." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, leaving the guests stunned into silence. Clara felt as though the world had tilted beneath her feet. She turned to James, searching his face for answers, but he avoided her eyes, staring down at his lap instead. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is she talking about?" The tension in the room was suffocating. Clara's father whispered in her ear, urging her to leave the church, but she couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the ground. "Please," she said louder this time, her voice cracking. "Someone explain what's going on." The woman, emboldened by Clara's plea, stepped closer. "He's hiding something, Clara. Something you deserve to know before you commit your life to him. Ask him about his past. Ask him about the promises he's broken." James finally looked up, his expression a mixture of guilt and anguish. "Enough, Margaret," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is neither the time nor the place." But Margaret was undeterred. "If not now, then when, James? You've been running from this for too long." She turned back to Clara, her eyes softening. "I'm sorry to ruin your day, but you need to know the truth before it's too late." The guests began whispering among themselves, their curiosity and discomfort palpable. Clara felt a lump forming in her throat. "James," she said, her voice trembling. "What is she talking about? Is there something you haven't told me?" James wheeled himself forward slightly, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Clara, I promise I was going to tell you. He paused, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to lose you." Clara's heart sank. The man she thought she knew, the man she trusted completely, was suddenly a stranger. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, determined to keep her composure. "Tell me now," she demanded, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Margaret opened her mouth to speak again, but the pastor intervened, raising his hands to calm the room. "Everyone, Please, he said, his voice commanding yet gentle. This is a sacred ceremony. Let us handle this matter privately. But Clara shook her head. No, she said firmly. If there's something I need to know, I want to hear it now. I deserve the truth. She looked at James, her eyes pleading. Please, James, whatever it is, just tell me. James hesitated, his chest rising and falling with deep, uneven breaths. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake, Clara. A terrible mistake, and I've been carrying it with me ever since. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. Clara's breath hitched as she waited for him to continue. It's not something I'm proud of, James said, his voice trembling. But it's a part of who I am. And I knew that if you found out, you might not want to be with me anymore. Margaret stepped forward again, her face a mixture of anger and sorrow. You should have told her, James. She deserved to know before standing here today. Clara's legs felt weak, and her father tightened his grip on her arm, steadying her. She looked at James, her mind racing. What could he have done that was so terrible? And why hadn't he trusted her enough to tell her the truth? I need to know everything, Clara said, her voice resolute. No more secrets, James. Not if we're going to build the life together. James nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'll tell you, he said, his voice cracking. But not here. Not in front of everyone. The guests watched in stunned silence as Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Then let's step outside, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Because I'm not walking down that aisle until I know the truth. As Clara and James moved toward the church doors, the whispers among the guests grew louder. Margaret followed closely behind, her expression unreadable. The tension was electric, the air heavy with anticipation. Clara knew that whatever she was about to hear would change everything, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But one thing was certain. She wouldn't move forward without understanding the full story. And as the church doors closed behind them, the first chapter of their wedding day took a turn no one could have predicted. Clara stood in the church garden, the ornate arch of flowers behind her contrasting starkly with the turmoil she felt inside. The cool breeze was a welcome relief from the stifling tension of the church, but it did little to calm her racing heart. James sat in his wheelchair, a few feet away, his head bowed. Margaret stood to the side, arms crossed, her eyes flicking between Clara and James with an almost maternal frustration. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of a bird oblivious to the drama unfolding below. Clara couldn't take it anymore. James, she said, her voice trembling but firm, start talking. Now. James exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping. Clara, first, I need you to know that everything I've ever felt for you is real. I love you more than anything, and I never wanted to hurt you. That's not an answer, Clara snapped, her tone sharper than she intended. What's this big secret you've been hiding? Why did this woman feel the need to storm into our wedding to tell me what you couldn't? Margaret stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. Clara, I didn't come here to hurt you. I came here to make sure you weren't blindsided like I was. Blindsided by what? Clara demanded, her patience thinning. Will someone just tell me what's going on? James raised his head, his eyes red and glassy. It's about my accident, he began. The one that put me in this wheelchair. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had always assumed the accident was a sensitive topic, something James preferred not to revisit. He had only mentioned it briefly when they first started dating, describing it as a tragic car crash that changed his life. She had never pressed for details, respecting his boundaries. Now she wondered if she had made a mistake. It wasn't an accident, James continued, his voice barely above a whisper. At least, not the way I told you. Clara's brow furrowed. What do you mean? James clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the fabric of his pants. 10 years ago, I made a terrible choice. I was young, reckless, and angry. I got into a fight with someone. A man I thought had wronged me. Things escalated, and I got behind the wheel, speeding away in a blind rage. Margaret cut in, her voice heavy with emotion. He's leaving out the part where his actions didn't just hurt himself. James caused an accident that changed multiple lives, including mine. Clara's stomach churned. She turned to Margaret. What are you saying? Margaret took a step closer, her eyes brimming with unused tears. James's car collided with my husband's. My husband didn't survive. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara's vision blurred as the weight of Margaret's words sank in. She looked back at James, her voice trembling. Is that true? Did you? James nodded slowly, tears spilling down his cheeks. Yes, he whispered. I killed her husband. And it's haunted me every day since. Clara stood in the church garden, the ornate arch of flowers behind her contrasting starkly with the turmoil she felt inside. The cool breeze was a welcome relief from the stifling tension of the church, but it did little to calm her racing heart. James sat in his wheelchair, a few feet away, his head bowed. Margaret stood to the side, arms crossed, her eyes flicking between Clara and James with an almost maternal frustration. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of a bird oblivious to the drama unfolding below. Clara couldn't take it anymore. James, she said, her voice trembling but firm, start talking. Now. James exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping. Clara, first, I need you to know that everything I've ever felt for you is real. I love you more than anything, and I never wanted to hurt you. That's not an answer, Clara snapped, her tone sharper than she intended. What's this big secret you've been hiding? Why did this woman feel the need to storm into our wedding to tell me what you couldn't? Margaret stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. Clara, I didn't come here to hurt you. I came here to make sure you weren't blindsided like I was. Blindsided by what? Clara demanded, her patience thinning. Will someone just tell me what's going on? James raised his head, his eyes red and glassy. It's about my accident, he began. The one that put me in this wheelchair. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had always assumed the accident was a sensitive topic, something James preferred not to revisit. He had only mentioned it briefly when they first started dating, describing it as a tragic car crash that changed his life. She had never pressed for details, respecting his boundaries. Now she wondered if she had made a mistake. It wasn't an accident. James continued, his voice barely above a whisper. At least, not the way I told you. Clara's brow furrowed. What do you mean? James clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the fabric of his pants. 10 years ago, I made a terrible choice. I was young, reckless, and angry. I got into a fight with someone. A man I thought had wronged me. Things escalated, and I got behind the wheel, speeding away in a blind rage. Margaret cut in, her voice heavy with emotion. He's leaving out the part where his actions didn't just hurt himself. James caused an accident that changed multiple lives, including mine. Clara's stomach churned. She turned to Margaret. What are you saying? Margaret took a step closer, her eyes brimming with unused tears. James's car collided with my husband's. My husband didn't survive. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Clara's vision blurred as the weight of Margaret's words sank in. She looked back at James, her voice trembling. Is that true? Did you? James nodded slowly, tears spilling down his cheeks. Yes, he whispered. I killed her husband, and it's haunted me every day since. Clara felt as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. She staggered backward, her hands clutching at the folds of her dress. The man she loved, the man she was about to marry, had taken someone's life, and he hadn't told her. I served time, James continued, his voice cracking. I was convicted of vehicular manslaughter and spent 5 years in prison. After my release, I vowed to turn my life around. That's when I started my business and tried to build something good out of the wreckage I caused. but I couldn't undo the pain I brought into Margaret's life, or anyone else's. Margaret's face hardened, her voice tinged with bitterness. You moved on. You built a new life. But I was left to pick up the pieces, to raise 2 children without their father. And now, here you are, about to start a new chapter as if none of it ever happened. Clara sat on the edge of her childhood bed, staring at the small porcelain lamp on her nightstand. The lamp had been there for years, a relic of her younger days, when life felt simple and untainted by adult complexities. Now, its warm glow seemed distant, unable to reach the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had left the church hours ago, slipping out through the back door while her parents distracted the bewildered guests. The wedding was officially postponed, but Clara knew it felt more like an unraveling than a pause. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand for the 5th time that hour. She glanced at the screen. James. His name stared back at her, a reminder of everything she had learned that day. She let it ring out, unable to bring herself to answer. What could she say? What could he say that would make any of this better? Clara's mother knocked softly on the door and peeked inside. "Sweetheart, are you hungry? You haven't eaten all day." Clara shook her head. "No, Mom. I need to be alone for a while." Her mother hesitated, clearly worried, but nodded. "All right. But remember, we're here if you need us." As the door clicked shut, Clara felt tears welling up again. She was exhausted from crying, but the hurt kept bubbling up, unrelenting. Her mind replayed the day's events over and over. The joy of walking down the aisle, the shock of Margaret's intrusion, and James's confession. Each memory stabbed at her like a dagger, sharp and unyielding. She couldn't reconcile the James she loved with the man who had caused such pain. He had been her safe place, her partner, her future. But now, he felt like a stranger. Clara reached for her laptop, hesitating before opening it. She needed answers, context, something to help her make sense of James's past. With trembling fingers, she typed his name into the search bar, followed by accident and trial. Within seconds, the screen was flooded with articles. Headlines leaped out at her. Man convicted in fatal car crash, sentenced to 5 years. Reckless driving incident leaves family devastated. Victim's widow speaks out. No sentence can bring him back. Clara clicked on one of the articles and began reading, her heart sinking with every word. The details were harrowing. James had been speeding after an argument with a coworker, swerving recklessly down a rain-slicked road. He lost control of his car and collided with another vehicle head-on. The other driver, Margaret's husband, died instantly, leaving behind 2 children and a grieving wife. The article included a photo of James from the trial. He looked younger, thinner, and utterly broken. Clara's stomach churned as she read a quote from Margaret. "I don't believe he's a monster, but his actions have destroyed my family. He took my husband, my children's father, and left us to pick up the pieces." Clara closed the laptop abruptly, unable to read anymore. She buried her face in her hands, her mind spinning. She wanted to hate James for what he had done, but the man in those articles wasn't the same man she knew now. James had been reckless and selfish, yes, but he had also spent years trying to atone for his actions. Could she hold his past against him when he had worked so hard to change? The next morning, Clara decided she couldn't avoid James forever. She needed to confront him, not as the bride-to-be he had disappointed, but as someone seeking the truth about the man she thought she knew. She texted him a simple message: "Meet me at the park bench near the lake at 10 a.m. No pleasantries, no emojis, just the bare essentials." When Clara arrived, James was already there, sitting on the bench with his head bowed. He looked up as she approached, his face pale and drawn. "Clara," he said softly, his voice laced with emotion. "Thank you for meeting me." She sat down beside him, keeping a deliberate distance between them. "I need answers, James. No more half-truths, no more omissions. I want to understand what happened and why you didn't tell me." James nodded, taking a deep breath before speaking. When the accident happened, I was a mess. I was angry, impulsive, and I thought the world owed me something. That day, I got into a fight with my coworker over something stupid. I left the office furious, and instead of calming down, I got behind the wheel. I wasn't drunk or high, but I might as well have been with how reckless I was driving. Then, it happened. He paused, his voice faltering. I don't even remember the crash itself, just the sound of metal twisting and the airbag deploying. When I came to, they told me the other driver hadn't survived. That's when everything changed. I was charged with vehicular manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Clara listened intently, her expression unreadable. What about Margaret? She asked. Did you ever try to make amends with her? James nodded. I wrote to her while I was in prison, but she never responded. I didn't blame her. How could she forgive me when I couldn't even forgive myself? After I got out, I donated to charities in her husband's name and supported causes that helped families affected by reckless driving. But it never felt like enough. And yet you didn't tell me, Clara said, her voice tinged with frustration. You've had years to come clean, James. Why wait until our wedding day to let me find out like this? James's eyes filled with tears. Because I was afraid, Clara. I thought if you knew, you'd see me as a killer, not the man I am now. I've spent every day trying to be someone worthy of you, and I was terrified that my past would take you away from me. Clara looked out at the lake, the water shimmering under the morning sun. James, I don't know what to think right now. I love you, but I don't know if I can move past this. It's not just about the accident. It's about the trust you broke by hiding it from me. James reached out, but Clara pulled away, standing up. I need time, she said. I can't make this decision today. James nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Take all the time you need. I'll wait for you, Clara, no matter what. As Clara walked away, she felt the weight of his words and the gravity of her own choices pressing down on her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. The path forward wouldn't be easy for either of them. Clara spent the next few days in a haze of confusion and heartache. She stayed with her parents, their cozy home offering a sanctuary from the chaos of her emotions. Her mother doted on her, bringing tea and gentle words of encouragement, while her father, though less verbal, offered his support through quiet presence. Clara appreciated their efforts, but nothing could dispel the storm in her heart. She wandered the town aimlessly one afternoon, seeking clarity. The streets, familiar yet distant, seemed alive with whispers. News of her postponed wedding had spread quickly, and though no one dared to approach her directly, she could feel their eyes on her, their curiosity palpable. Clara ignored it, focusing instead on the rhythm of her footsteps and the crisp autumn air. Her path led her to an old bookstore on Main Street, a place she had frequented as a child. She hadn't been there in years, but something drew her inside. The scent of aged paper and leather bindings greeted her like an old friend. She browsed aimlessly until her eyes landed on a book titled The Weight of Forgiveness. Intrigued, she pulled it from the shelf and began to read. The book chronicled real stories of people who had faced unimaginable betrayals or losses and found the strength to forgive. Clara found herself absorbed in their accounts, parents forgiving the drunk drivers who had taken their children, spouses reconciling after years of infidelity, friends mending bonds broken by betrayal. Each story was raw and painful, yet somehow hopeful. It made her question her own capacity for forgiveness. Could she find it within herself to forgive James, not just for his actions, but for hiding them from her? The shop owner, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, noticed Clara engrossed in the book and approached her. "You look like someone searching for answers," she said softly. Clara looked up, startled, but nodded. "I guess I am." The woman smiled gently. "Forgiveness isn't easy, you know. It's not about forgetting or excusing what happened. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and pain." Clara clutched the book tighter. But what if forgiving feels like betraying the people who were hurt? The woman tilted her head thoughtfully. Forgiveness doesn't mean there are no consequences for someone's actions. It means you choose to let go of the power their actions have over your heart. It's more about you than them. Clara left the store with the book in hand and a lot to think about. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with her parents and told them everything about James's past, Margaret's interruption, and her own inner turmoil. Her father, usually a man of few words, surprised her with his insight. "Clara," he said, his voice steady, "you've always been someone who sees the best in people. That's one of the things I admire most about you. But seeing the best in someone doesn't mean ignoring the worst. You need to decide if the man James is today is someone you can trust and build a life with." Her mother chimed in. "And remember, sweetheart, forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. If you choose to forgive him, it's not about excusing what he did. It's about deciding what you want for your future." The next morning, Clara made a decision. She needed to speak with Margaret again. It wasn't enough to hear James's side of the story. She needed to understand the depth of Margaret's pain and whether forgiveness was even possible. Clara reached out to Margaret through a mutual acquaintance, and to her surprise, Margaret agreed to meet. They chose a quiet cafe on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. When Clara arrived, Margaret was already there, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. "Thank you for meeting me," Clara said as she sat down. Margaret nodded, her expression guarded. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk to me after everything." Clara hesitated, unsure how to begin. Finally, she said, "I need to understand. I need to know what James did to your family, and how you've managed to live with it all these years." Margaret's eyes softened slightly, and she took a deep breath. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "When I lost my husband, it felt like my whole world fell apart. He was my partner, my anchor, and suddenly, he was gone. And James was the reason for that." Clara listened intently as Margaret recounted the aftermath of the accident, the grief, the anger, the struggle to raise her children alone. But then Margaret surprised her. "For a long time, I hated James," Margaret said. "I blamed him for everything. But over the years, I've come to see that he's not the same man he was back then. He's tried to make amends in his own way, and while it doesn't erase what happened, it does show me that he's changed." Clara leaned forward, her voice quiet. "Do you think he deserves forgiveness?" Margaret sighed. "That's not for me to say. Forgiveness isn't about what he deserves. It's about what you can live with. I've forgiven him in my heart, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten. And it doesn't mean you have to forgive him, either. You have to make that choice for yourself." Clara left the cafe feeling lighter yet still uncertain. Margaret's words echoed in her mind as she walked back home. Forgiveness wasn't about James. It was about her. Could she let go of the anger and betrayal she felt? Could she find a way to move forward without being consumed by the past? That evening, Clara called James. "I need to see you," she said simply. When James arrived at her parents' house, he looked as though he hadn't slept in days. They sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. "I talked to Margaret," Clara began. "I needed to hear her side of the story." James nodded, his expression somber. "I understand." "She told me she's forgiven you," Clara said. "Not because she had to, but because it was the only way she could move on." James's eyes glistened with tears. "I don't deserve her forgiveness, or yours, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it if you let me." Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "James, I love you. But love isn't enough without trust. If we're going to move forward, there can't be any more secrets. I need you to be completely honest with me, no matter how hard it is." "I promise," James said, his voice breaking. "No more secrets." Clara reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "Then let's take this one step at a time. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm willing to try." James nodded, tears streaming down his face. "That's all I could ever ask for." As they sat together, the weight of the past began to lift, replaced by the fragile hope of a new beginning. It wouldn't be easy, but Clara knew that forgiveness, like love, was a choice, one she was finally ready to make. The days following Clara's decision were far from smooth. While she and James had agreed to move forward, the road to rebuilding trust was steep and riddled with obstacles. For Clara, the weight of James's secret still lingered, casting a shadow over the love they had once shared so effortlessly. For James, the challenge lay in proving his sincerity, not just to Clara, but also to himself. Despite their mutual determination, the process was anything but linear. Clara returned to her apartment, seeking a sense of normalcy amidst the upheaval. The half-packed wedding gifts and decorations scattered throughout the living room served as constant reminders of the life she had almost stepped into unprepared. She spent hours rearranging furniture, clearing clutter, and finding solace in mundane tasks. But even as she tried to move forward, her mind often wandered back to James and the enormity of their situation. James, meanwhile, threw himself into community work. He partnered with local organizations that supported families affected by reckless driving, using his experience to educate others about the devastating consequences of split-second decisions. He spoke at schools, shared his story at community events, and donated generously to causes close to Margaret's heart. Each act of service was a small step toward redemption, though James knew it could never fully erase his guilt. Despite their individual efforts, Clara and James struggled to find their footing as a couple. Their conversations were often strained, peppered with moments of vulnerability, but also awkward silences. Clara's trust had been shaken to its core, and while she wanted to believe in James's commitment to change, doubt lingered in the corners of her mind. One evening, James invited Clara to attend a support group meeting with him. It was a group for individuals and families affected by reckless driving, both survivors and those who had caused accidents. Clara hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to confront the raw emotions such a gathering would undoubtedly stir, but James's earnestness convinced her to give it a chance. The meeting was held in a modest community center, the room filled with a diverse group of people. Some shared stories of grief and loss, their pain palpable even years later. Others spoke of guilt and the lifelong journey of atonement. One woman, in particular, stood out to Clara. She was a mother who had lost her teenage son in a drunk driving accident. Despite her loss, she spoke of finding peace through forgiveness, her voice steady and calm. "I realized that holding on to anger was only hurting me," the woman said. "Forgiving the man who killed my son didn't mean I excused what he did. It meant I chose to let go of the pain that was holding me hostage." Clara felt tears streaming down her face as the woman spoke. She glanced at James, who was listening intently, his expression somber. For the first time, Clara saw the depths of James's regret not as an excuse, but as a genuine desire to make things right. It didn't erase the past, but it gave her a glimpse of the man he was striving to become. After the meeting, Clara and James walked to the parking lot in silence. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine. James turned to Clara, his voice soft. "Thank you for coming tonight. It means a lot to me." Clara nodded, her emotions still raw. Hearing their stories, "It made me realize how much pain one moment can cause. But it also made me realize how much strength it takes to try and heal." James reached for her hand hesitantly, and for the first time in weeks, Clara didn't pull away. "I'm not perfect, Clara," he said, his voice trembling. "I've made more mistakes than I can count, but I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be a man you can be proud of." Clara looked into his eyes, searching for the truth in his words. "I don't need you to be perfect, James. I just need you to be honest, even when it's hard." James nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. "I can do that. I promise." As the weeks turned into months, Clara and James worked to rebuild their relationship one step at a time. They attended counseling sessions together, where they learned how to communicate more openly and navigate the complexities of their past. Clara found herself opening up about her own fears and insecurities, while James confronted the guilt he had buried for so long. Their journey wasn't without setbacks. There were arguments, moments of doubt, and times when Clara questioned whether their love could survive the weight of their shared history. But each time they stumbled, they found a way to pick themselves back up, their bond growing stronger with every hurdle they overcame. The community, too, began to shift. Margaret, once a symbol of the pain James had caused, became an unlikely ally. She joined him in his efforts to raise awareness about reckless driving, their shared goal fostering a sense of mutual respect. Margaret's children, now teenagers, even attended one of James's talks, their presence a testament to the power of healing and reconciliation. Clara also found unexpected support in the townspeople who had once whispered about her postponed wedding. Some approached her with words of encouragement, sharing their own stories of forgiveness and resilience. Others simply offered a kind smile, their understanding unspoken but deeply felt. As the anniversary of their postponed wedding approached, Clara and James found themselves standing at a crossroads. They had come a long way, but the question of their future still loomed large. James, ever respectful of Clara's feelings, left the decision in her hands. One evening, as they sat together on Clara's balcony overlooking the town, James broke the silence. "Clara, I need to know, are we ready to take the next step, or do you need more time?" Clara looked out at the horizon, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. She thought about everything they had been through, the pain, the growth, the love that had endured despite it all. Finally, she turned to James, her expression resolute. "I think we're ready," she said softly. "But this time, we do it our way. No grand ceremonies, no pressure, just us and the people who matter most." James's face lit up with a smile, his eyes brimming with tears. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As they embraced, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. Their journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt confident in their ability to face whatever came next together. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real, and that was enough. The day of Clara and James's second wedding dawned with an air of quiet simplicity. Gone were the elaborate plans, the grand venue, and the endless guest list. This time, the ceremony was held in the garden of Clara's parents' home, surrounded by close family, a few dear friends, and the vibrant bloom of late spring flowers. The atmosphere was intimate and serene, reflecting the deep, hard-earned love that had brought Clara and James to this moment. Clara stood in her childhood bedroom, gazing into the antique mirror as she adjusted the simple pearl necklace around her neck. Her dress was modest, a flowing ivory gown that brushed against the floor. Her mother fussed over her veil, smoothing it gently as Clara smiled. It wasn't the over-the-top affair they had planned months ago, but it felt right, more authentic, more meaningful. "Are you nervous?" her mother asked, stepping back to admire her daughter. Clara shook her head, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Not nervous, just ready. It's been a long journey to get here." Her mother nodded, her eyes misty with emotion. "Your father and I are so proud of you, Clara. It takes strength to face the challenges you faced and still choose love." Clara's father appeared in the doorway, his usual stoic demeanor softened by the occasion. "It's time," he said, extending his arm to her. As Clara walked through the familiar hallways of her childhood home, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. This house had seen her through every stage of life, her struggles, her triumphs, and now, her new beginning. When she stepped outside, the garden came alive with the soft murmur of voices and the gentle strumming of a guitar. James waited for her at the end of the aisle, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of love and reverence. Unlike their first attempt at a wedding, there was no dramatic interruption this time. Margaret was there, seated in the second row with her children. Her presence was a quiet but powerful acknowledgement of the progress they had all made. Clara had been nervous about inviting her, but Margaret had accepted with grace, understanding the significance of this day for everyone involved. As Clara reached the altar, James wheeled himself slightly closer, his smile radiating warmth. He wore a simple suit, his boutonniere a single white rose. The officiant, a close friend of Clara's family, began the ceremony with a heartfelt speech about resilience and the power of second chances. Clara's heart swelled with emotion as she looked at James, the man who had both hurt and healed her, the man who had become a living testament to change. When it came time for their vows, James spoke first. His voice trembled with emotion as he addressed Clara and the small gathering of loved ones. Clara, you've shown me what love truly means. Not the kind of love that's fleeting or perfect, but the kind that endures, the kind that sees flaws and chooses to stay. I will spend every day of my life working to be the man you deserve, because you've given me a gift I can never repay, your forgiveness. Clara blinked back tears as she began her own vows. James, loving you hasn't always been easy, but it's always been worth it. You've shown me that people are more than their mistakes, that growth and redemption are possible. I don't promise to forget the past, but I promise to move forward with you, to build a future rooted in honesty and trust. Together, we are stronger than the challenges we faced. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, a wave of applause rippled through the garden. Clara leaned down to kiss James, her veil brushing his cheek as their lips met. The moment was simple, tender, and perfect. The reception was just as understated as the ceremony. Guests gathered under a large oak tree, sipping lemonade and sharing laughter. Instead of a traditional wedding cake, there was a spread of Clara's favorite desserts, homemade by her mother and aunts. Children played tag on the lawn, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of conversation. Margaret approached Clara during the festivities, her expression thoughtful. "You look beautiful, Clara," Margaret said, her voice sincere. "Thank you," Clara replied, her tone equally warm. "And thank you for being here. It means more to me than you know." Margaret nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I've spent so many years holding on to anger, but seeing you and James today, I realize that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means making room for something better. I hope you both find the happiness you deserve." As the evening wore on, Clara and James sat together beneath the oak tree, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and pink. The air was filled with the soft chirping of crickets and the gentle hum of contentment. Clara rested her head on James's shoulder, her hand clasped in his. "This feels different," James said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Clara looked up at him, her brow furrowed slightly. "Different how?" "Better," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "This time, it's not about the fairy tale or the perfect image. It's about us, flaws, scars, and all. And I wouldn't trade it for anything." Clara smiled, her heart full. "Neither would I." As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Their love had been tested in ways she never could have imagined, but it had emerged stronger, deeper, and more authentic. They weren't the same people they had been when they first met, and that was okay. They had grown, together and apart, and now they were ready to build a life rooted in truth and resilience. The evening ended with a small sparkler send-off, the guests cheering as Clara and James made their way down the garden path. As they drove away in James's car, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Looking over at James, she reached for his hand. "You know," she said with a teasing smile, "for all the twists and turns, I think our story turned out pretty well." James chuckled, his grip tightening on her hand. "It's only just beginning." And as the car disappeared into the night, the couple carried with them the lessons of their past, the hope of their future, and a love that had proven itself capable of weathering any storm. It wasn't a story of perfection. It was a story of redemption, forgiveness, and the beauty of second chances.